Bienvenidos, buenas tardes en México, buenos días en Nueva Zelanda. Welcome everybody. Kia ora tatou katoa. Good afternoon in Mexico, good morning in New Zealand. Welcome to this first colloquium of Mexican and New Zealand studies. We're very excited of this opportunity to learn about each other from New Zealand to Mexico, from Mexico to New Zealand, across the Pacific. This panel is on literature, comparative literature. So we're going to hear about New Zealand literature first from Dr. Philip Steer from Massey University. And then we're going to hear about Mexican literature from Dr. David Garcia from UNAM. So welcome both panelists. We're very excited. I'm going to introduce Dr. Philip Steer, who's going to present on forest and deforestation in New Zealand's colonial literature. Philip Steer is Associate Professor of English at Massey University. His research explores the intersection of literary culture, economics, and environment in colonial New Zealand and Australia. He is author of Settler Colonialism in Victorian Literature, Economics and Political Identity in the Networks of Empire by Cambridge University Press, 2020. And he is co-editor of Ecological Form, System and Aesthetics in the Age of Empire, Fordham University Press, 2019. So welcome, Philip, bienvenido. The screen is yours.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here and to join in this important event. Today, we are increasingly aware of environmental problems being caused by human impacts at local, national, and global levels. And one of the powerful factors in these issues are the social norms and attitudes that shape the way in which the environment is valued or not valued. One way to understand these issues better today is to look at the role played by culture in previous environmental transformations. So I'm particularly interested in the 19th century, when the arrival of Europeans in Aotearoa, New Zealand, brought about a vast environmental transformation in a very short space of time. In broad terms, the colonists justified what they were doing with the language of modernization and progress. They saw New Zealand's ecosystems as archaic and unproductive environments, and they felt it was both inevitable and desirable that these should be replaced by pastoralism and agriculture. We can see this logic encapsulated in a lecture given in 1869 by the naturalist and politician W.T.L. Travers, and that's the first slide. The lecture titled On the Changes Affected in the Natural Features of a New Country by the Introduction of Civilized Races. And the title tells us the way in which environmental transformation was inseparable from racism, and this became even more evident in Travers' comments about the speed of change. So if we could have the next slide. So he says, the face of the country, the life native to its soil, and the Aboriginal race which claimed it are all being modified, effaced, and displaced. The rapidity of such changes strikes the onlooker with astonishment, and it is inconceivable to those who have not witnessed it for themselves. He says the progress of a single year outspeeds the work of centuries. And amid the charred stumps of our hillside forests, you may trace, he says, the handsome villas and luxurious plantations of proprietors. And he says, looking at this scene of progress, in his view, even the most sensitive philanthropist may learn to look with resignation, if not complacency, on the extinction of a people which in the past had accomplished so imperfectly every object of man's being. So saying that the colony's environment is changing very fast in the name of progress. If we want to understand more about the environmental attitudes of colonial society, one important place to look is in their literature. And in my talk today, I want to focus in particular on how colonists responded to New Zealand's forests by introducing you to a range of texts that help us to see those responses as more complex and varied than we might first expect. So the next slide, please. And the next one. Great. So first I want to talk about the forests and what happened to them. And you can see the change here from 1840 to 2000, the disappearance of the greens, the disappearance of forests, especially in the North Island there. In the Māori creation story, the world begins with the Sky Father, Ranginui, and the Earth Mother, Papatuanuku, who were locked in such a tight embrace that their children lived in perpetual darkness. The children of Ranginui and Papatuanuku agreed that they must separate their parents, but only one of them proved strong enough to do so, and that is Tane Mahuta, or Tane Nuiarangi, who's the god of the forest. So Tane thus brought light to the world. He also brought down from the heavens to the earth the baskets of knowledge, of wisdom and understanding. And the traditional Māori worldview is thus defined by relationships between the human and the natural. The scholar Te Ahukaramu Charles Royal points out that the entire world was seen as a vast and complex whānau, or family. And Te Waunui a Tane, or the great forest of Tane, the god of the forest, that the great forest was central to Māori. It not only provided food, but it provided meaning and was held in reverence. This great forest of Tane was also of vital importance to British colonists, but for very different reasons. At the time when British sovereignty was imposed in New Zealand in 1840, forest covered about 2/3 of the North Island, as you can see in the first map, and about 1/3 of the very different terrain of the South Island. However, Europeans had been interested in New Zealand's forests for many decades before then as a source of masts for ships, especially for the British Navy and for merchant fleets based in Sydney, Australia. But as British settlers began to pour into New Zealand after 1840, the reasons for deforestation expanded, and the rate of deforestation began to increase dramatically as well. As the historian Graham Wynne points out, wood was central to almost every aspect of the colony's life, culture, and economy. And the next slide, please. He writes, 19th century New Zealand was a wooden world. Its citizens' very existence rested on the forest's bounty. In 1881, 7 of every 8 New Zealanders lived in a wooden dwelling. Families burned between 2 and 4 tons of firewood per person per year. The ships that plied the coastal trade, the carts and carriages linking the farms and markets and ports, they were all built of New Zealand wood. Bridges were made of wood, logs were laid down to form roads, wooden sleepers supported the railway tracks, wooden poles supported telegraph lines, wooden posts carried the fencing wire around the fields of the growing number of farms. Without exploitation of the bush, he says, New Zealand could not have developed as it did. And if we just see the next slide. On one hand, many tree species, such as the kauri here, became valuable, either within the local colonial economy or for export. And on the other hand, settlers who were looking to establish farms found that much of the most suitable land first had to be cleared of forest cover. Driven by these economic forces, deforestation took place in the second half of the 19th century, especially in the North Island, on a vast and increasing scale. So as might be understandable, colonial literary responses to the forest often celebrated destruction and replacement of forest with farmland as evidence of progress and modernization. Those representations often supported this view by portraying the forest as an enemy of civilization. So a novel published in 1899 called In the Shadow of the Bush, a New Zealand romance, that novel describes settlement in the southern part of the North Island as a kind of gradual invasion of the forest. Next slide. The novel begins, occasionally a settler or a community of settlers more enterprising than others would make a leap far in advance of their comrades, a bolder dash upon the timbered foe, and take up an isolated position in the very heart of the enemy, only to be passed and turned and left behind after a year or two by the still advancing march of settlement. And this same novel also acknowledged that these clearings made by the colonists were often unattractive, due to the forest wreckage that was everywhere seen. But nevertheless, the novel explains that beauty could be found instead in the future idea of its transformation into farmland. So the next slide, please. So the same novel continues. To the artistic eye, the bush clearings, especially in their earlier stages, may appear as a sore blemish on the face of the landscape. But it says, even these roughest of these primitive clearings give to experienced eyes, to colonist eyes, promise of smooth pastures or abundant harvests in the not very distant future. And if we see the next slide, this is the area that this novel is talking about. And you can see this would be an example of one of these clearings being established and the forest being burned and cut down to turn into farmland. Such texts as this novel reveal how normal it was for many settlers to feel that they could remake an entire ecosystem due to its perceived lack of economic value. Now, some writers did express a more critical attitude towards the dominance of economic attitudes within settler culture. And for example, a poem by the South Island poet Dougal Ferguson is highly critical of what it called a sad personage with nature mean, which is someone who has cut down an enormous tree in the area that had previously been spared the rest of the deforestation. So the next slide, please. So this poem criticizing that action describes the feeling, but anger soon with sorrow blends when told what sent its sentence forth, that had no place in paltry ends connected with its market worth, that wields o'er men such potent law and doomed it to the woodman's saw. So saying a mixture of anger and sorrow when learning that it's been cut down for money, not for any, and no other value of the tree has been appreciated. The comic poet George Phipps Williams also scrutinized this exploitative attitude in his poem, A Globetrotter's View of New Zealand, which pretended to be a letter to Britain from someone visiting New Zealand. So we have the next slide. He says, if you see a man solemnly gazing alone at some kingly old totara, which is a kind of a grand tree, splendidly grown, and uprearing its head till the skies it can kiss, you may safely conclude that the subject is this, of the deep meditation in which he is sunk, not the glorious beauty he's inwardly drunk, but the number of feet he can cut from its trunk. So these poems of criticism and satire reveal the predominant contrast to assessing the environment in economic terms was to do so in aesthetic terms. There's the economic versus the aesthetic. So settler expressions of environmental beauty are understandably strongly influenced by the tradition of romantic poetry, and especially the writings of William Wordsworth in Britain. And they often present the image of an individual's ability to retreat into what they term the temple of nature. This is the naturalist William Colenso writing in a scientific journal about ferns in 1882. The next slide, please. He writes, in one spot in particular, deeply secluded in the quiet recesses of the grand old forest, a spot very dear to me, I have repeatedly noticed and pleasingly contemplated a large number of species of ferns, more than I have ever seen growing together in all my wanderings in New Zealand, and all too flourishing luxuriantly. So here's a very kind of romantic expression in a scientific journal. The painter Alfred Sharp was also a prolific poet, and his poem from 1888, called The Forest Temples of New Zealand, also expresses a similar romantic response to the forest as a spiritual kind of experience. So the next slide, please. In the end of this poem about being in the forest, he writes, blessed is he whose soul expands with such beauty spread around, for the solemn forest aisles, I to him are holy ground. Temples reared by human hands may be grand and may be fair, but who worships nature's God never worships truly there. He to forest temples goes, from all human things apart. And if we just see the next slide, this is an example of the kind of art that poet Alfred Sharp was also producing at the time, the sense of the forest set apart from the human. So these examples demonstrate that settler ideas of environmental beauty involved imagining the forest as separate to any sustained human presence. One, I think, fascinating alternative to aesthetic value can be found in a poem from the Thames region in the northern half of the North Island called The Big Kauri Waitahi Creek by the poet Margaret Sinclair. Now, kauri was a species that had immense commercial value by the end of the 19th century, but this particular tree had become something of a tourist attraction in the area. And this poem is about that tree, and it praises its sheer age, first of all. So if we see the next slide. Again, this language of nature's temple, enshrined in a temple of nature's own making, reared in its silence, impressive, profound, when axes, the echoes of Lebanon waking, felled her proud cedars in scores to the ground, thy leaves were unstirred by a treacherous sound. So what it's saying is this kauri tree has stood there throughout history since at least the time of the Bible, when the cedars of Lebanon were being cut down to make the temple. So what the poem goes on to talk about is a sense of patriotic pride that settlers might feel towards this very old tree. So if we see the next slide, it says, old England may boast of her oak trees that flourish on woodland and lea and exult in their fame. California's bayou and canyon may nourish proud Wellingtonia's unrivaled claim, and that's the redwood. Towards thee, the kauri, Thames' heart will beat ever the same. And if we see the next slide, this is an image from an official government publication around this time of the tree that the poem is talking about. And it's taken from a photograph, and these images circulated around of this particular tree. So here we can see an example of settler national identity being linked to ideas of the uniqueness of New Zealand's nature. So there's an irony here that in the patriotic valuation of individual trees might lead to their protection, even as the economic valuation of forests was leading to their destruction. So these two are in tension, at least. It's very rare, though, to find writers who are able to think about forests in a kind of a wider ecological sense. For example, when writers might describe the trees in the forest, they tend not to also see or think about the animal species that both depend on and sustain the forest. One of the few examples where this does happen, though, is a lament called The Passing of the Forest by a man called William Pember Reeves, who was also a historian and a socialist politician. His poem is a response to the destruction of kauri forests, like the image on your screen at the moment. And his poem offers a catalogue of the life forms that were also lost along with the trees. And he begins partly by describing the complexity of plant life in the forest. So if we see the next slide.
Sorry, Philip, we should be rounding up now. Yeah.
Yeah, I have one page. He says, gone is the forest world, its wealth of life, its jostling, crowding, thrusting, struggling race. And then if we turn to the next slide, he also turns to the bird life that's also dependent on the forest for survival. He says, gone are the forest birds, arboreal things, wild, harmless, hamadryad creatures that lived for their trees and died and passed away. So even in this lament, however, the value of the forest is ultimately expressed in terms of aesthetic value. The poem's final couplet concludes, bitter the thought, is this the price we pay, the price for progress, beauty swept away. So in brief conclusion, there we go. I've been suggesting that colonial literature tells us not only about the predominantly economic way in which forests were valued by settlers in New Zealand, but also about some other forms of value that also circulated and shaped attitudes. Most notable of these is a sense of aesthetic value, but the writing that expresses such ideas also highlights its limitations. Environmental beauty tends to be understood as separate from any ongoing human presence, and also tends not to allow for ideas of ecological value. And more broadly, the prevalence of these ideas of empty forests might help us understand why there's almost no acknowledgement in colonial literature of the value placed by Māori on the forest. So colonial literature also challenges us in the present to consider what environmental voices we do not hear today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Philip, for a wonderful presentation. Lots to think about. ecology and poetry together. Wonderful. Okay, so now I want to introduce Dr. David Garcia Perez. He's going to offer us un retrato parcial de la literatura mexicana del siglo XX, a general overview of Mexican literature of the 20th century. Dr. David Garcia holds a PhD in classical letters from the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM. He's a researcher for the Center for Classical Studies of the Institute of Philological Investigations and full professor of Greek literature at the College of Classical Letters. He teaches at the postgraduate level both letters and education. His research focuses on the philology of classical Greek and comparative literature, classical rhetorics, and mythology. His most recent book deals with the reinterpretation of Greek and Latin classics. His most recent article is titled The Plague of Tyrant Oedipus, Politics, Medicine, and Excess. And his most recent book chapter is Rebellion and Utopia in the Narrative of Carlos Montemayor. So, bienvenido, Dr. Garcia Perez, welcome. I will be assisting with some translation as the presentation goes. So we need to be mindful of time, okay? And I will request Dr. Garcia Perez to pause every now and then so I can recap and provide the translation, if that's okay.
Gracias. Decía que doy las gracias a la doctora Alicia Gironia de la Vega por haberme invitado a este evento. Voy a empezar a leer ya para aprovechar el tiempo. ¿En dónde inicia la historia de la literatura mexicana? La noción de apellido que acompaña a toda literatura implica sin duda una circunscripción geográfica más o menos definida, pues la lengua y su representación literaria es lo que en todo caso traza una línea siempre en movimiento que por fortuna deja de lado las fronteras político-geográficas. Sin embargo, sí.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the question is, how does Mexican literature begin? Especially when we have into account that we're talking about language without a geographical or a political clearly delineated limits or maps.
Sin embargo, más problemático resulta comprender que la denominación lleva consigo un bagaje ideológico poco asible y con menos posibilidades de ser una unidad analítica. De este modo, el tratar de diferenciar una literatura mexicana de otra identificada como peruana, chilena, argentina, etc., es una clara señal de la inoperancia del análisis a partir de una premisa estrictamente geográfico-ideológica.
Okay, so Dr. Garcia Perez is talking about the difficulty in clearly delineating literatures when we talk about just geographical frontiers, when we talk about Peruvian literature or Argentinian literature, especially when we embark in this kind of enterprise of a construct of a national literature, there's always an ideological project behind.
El argumento más firme para la definición de una literatura se halla en su material básico, el lenguaje. Todo lenguaje específico parte de una lengua común, que en el caso de México es el español, y he ahí otro escollo. En el contexto de la civilización occidental, se debe a Dante Alighieri la primera reflexión en su tratado de Vulgaria y Elocuentia sobre la validez de escribir en la lengua vernácula, abandonando otras lenguas que resultan artificiales, dada la evolución cultural enraizada en la lengua materna. La idea del florentino giró en torno a la separación de las lenguas clásicas, en español, en especial del latín, de aquellas vulgares que carecían de un sentido o de un valor estético literario.
Now, he's referring to the value, the absolute value that we can take as our guide to the creation of a Mexican literature would be language. But this is problematic too, because if we talk about the language in Mexico, we talk about Spanish, but he goes back to Dante Alighieri and the idea of vulgar languages or popular languages when talking about Latin or Greek classical languages, and the validity of the languages that people speak. So this is problematic again.
Desde esta perspectiva, es evidente que el reconocimiento de una estética literaria mexicana no siguió el camino de las lenguas prehispánicas. Ellas tenían su propia literatura, y en algunos casos, como el del náhuatl y el maya, hoy siguen teniendo una tradición literaria vigente. Miguel León Portilla, por ejemplo, ha demostrado la existencia de tal literatura ante el olvido y desdén en que se encontraba, y aquella se le vinculaba con lo mexicano, era en la medida en que existe una reciprocidad cultural. La literatura mestiza continuó naturalmente su trazo prehispánico, y la literatura prehispánica cambió su rostro con la llegada e influencia del español.
When talking about Mexican literature then, the idea is to see how Mexican literature is in conversation with, or how it has evolved from Spanish with Spanish, separate from, sort of in a parallel trajectory to Mayan and Nahuatl literatures. So the idea would be to think and to look at how these traditions, which have continued their own trajectories, are influencing or are influenced by Spanish.
Pues bien, si el español es la lengua de la literatura mexicana, ¿cuál es la identidad que se puede rastrear en los que ésta lleva de existencia? No se podría hablar, como en el caso de Dante y su reflexión en torno al latín y las lenguas vulgares, que el español ibérico debía ser separado de los pueblos conquistados para generar una tradición propia. Es decir, que se hubiese considerado a alguna lengua vernácula como identitaria de lo mexicano, al español como una lengua artificial. Lo que en todo caso se puede afirmar es que hubo una vinculación lingüística que creó una serie de líneas de creación exponenciales por medio de contacto cultural. A la tradición castellana se sumaron otras culturas lingüísticas que originaron no propiamente una lengua nueva, pero sí una literatura, una comprensión del mundo divergente.
So this is the proposal. The proposal from the Hispanic Peninsula, from Spain. The mother tongue, Spanish, comes to Mexico and enters into dialogue with these cultures, with these languages, and creates a new literature in Spanish, not in the original languages, but with those traditions, myths, and world visions, to give way to what we can call a Mexican literature.
En efecto, bastaría una rápida mirada a los primeros años del colonialismo para admirar la profusión literaria ya existente en los diversos géneros usados en ese entonces. Resalta en el siglo XVI la imitación de la poesía italianizante y del teatro alegórico a la usanza de las tradiciones religiosas de España. Sobresale también el manejo de la literatura de la antigüedad clásica frente a la inspiración, sobre todo en el aspecto mitológico. Lo anterior permite observar cómo una tradición literaria como la europea continuó su vía creativa y cómo las tradiciones literarias españolas pronto se cimentaron características existentes. Así pues, la producción de la colonia fue acotada por las corrientes que prevalecían en la metrópoli. Renacentismo, barroco, neoclásico, se siguieron uno tras otro en el espacio colonial, alimentándose, no obstante, del contexto americano.
So this literature that was being born in Mexico followed the trends and the movements in the metropoli, in the center, which was Europe. So the Renaissance, the Baroque, Neoclassicism appeared in Mexico in its very specific form in Spanish, but always with the influences from the context.
Las literaturas son fundacionales en la medida en la que desarrollan una épica afianzada en la tradición mítica religiosa. Esta ocupó primordialmente el espacio de la historia, a falta de un discurso que grabara los acontecimientos y costumbres de los pueblos. La poesía épica se encargó de tejer los lazos de unión sociocultural La épica funcionó como espejo de los avatares históricos. En este sentido, es claro que en la recuperación de los orígenes de lo mexicano se vuelve la mirada hacia la poesía prehispánica, de suerte que un referente de la fundación se hallaría en diversos materiales que sobrevivieron a la destrucción, o bien son producto de arduos trabajos filológicos.
So the search to define this new literature was, of course, to myth and to an epic poetry that can tell the history and the story of Mexico. And for this, the literature in Mexico went back to pre-Hispanic times and to pre-Hispanic texts, the very few that survived the conquest.
Y la herencia española, si bien es cierto que el Quijote es la obra que dio firme entramado al castellano como lengua literaria y germinal de los pueblos centrales de la península ibérica, en los pueblos conquistados la rama cultural que se tendió en la construcción lingüística fue obra de los misioneros. Si para 1523 estos vieron que los indígenas no conocían absolutamente nada, según su visión europea cuasi medieval, ya para el año 1544 el obispo Zumárraga daba constancia de que muchos indígenas que sabían leer no solo español, sino también latín. Entonces, la tradición de esa literatura es también piedra fundamental para la definición de lo mexicano.
So this epic or this tradition is rescued in great part also to the presence of European missionaries who by mid-16th century found that Aboriginal peoples could read not only in Spanish, but also in Latin. So this presence is co-creator, or these people are co-creators of the Mexican tradition.
No se trató entonces solamente del encuentro entre llano y sino que en el primer una cauda cultural enorme cuyas raíces se unen a la antigüedad grecolatina. Y para el segundo es necesario comprender el acrisolamiento de las muy diversas visiones cosmogónicas en el marco de un nuevo rostro literario. Entonces, como apuntó Sapir, la herramienta esencial de la literatura es el lenguaje. Esta premisa no responde per se a la explicación de una genética de la literatura mexicana. Lo que procede entonces es hallar su origen en la práctica que indiscutiblemente va al genio y espíritu de los pueblos que iniciaron su refundición en la conquista.
Okay, so we are online, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so en los años 80 y 90 fue notoria la producción narrativa y poética, sobre todo en el ámbito de la llamada posmodernidad. La novela histórica cobró vigencia a partir de una descentralización discursiva que ponía en tela de juicio las virtudes de la historia oficial a partir de una focalización de los actores periféricos. Los componentes de la cultura posmoderna, inyectada con la potencia de los medios de comunicación masiva, se han convertido en materia e inspiración literarias. Los programas televisivos, las imágenes icónicas repetidas hasta la náusea, el periodismo literario, la estética kitsch, la moda, entre otros elementos, son ahora motivo del quehacer literario. Heredera de la vanguardia, la literatura posmoderna es lúdica desde el nivel de sus objetivos hasta llegar a la transformación del lenguaje, cuyas pretensiones se asomaron en la ventana de los años 60 con los escritores de la onda, pero ahí no hubo mayor trascendencia. Y en efecto, se puede decir que fue una moda literaria en estricto sentido.
So here, Dr. Garcia is going back to the 80s and 90s and talking about postmodernity and the idea that peripheral or marginal voices are emerging from TV, from popular press, begin to take a center stage or a more protagonist role in Mexican literature. Journalism, and there is this new angle, which of course is ludic, so it's playful, and this is what defines the 80s and 90s literature in Mexico.
La revolución como tema ha pasado a un segundo término en las últimas décadas del siglo XX, no obstante que han sido publicadas algunas novelas que han vuelto sobre este problema histórico. Así, Ángeles Mastretta escribió Arráncame la vida, 1985, novela que puede ser correspondiente a la muerte de Artemio Cruz, en el modo en que el movimiento revolucionario es desarticulado por la traición de los personajes masculinos, pero que es distinta, porque el tono de la seriedad discursiva cede ante el desparpajo con el que Catalina, la protagonista, analiza el machismo revolucionario. Por su parte, en Como agua para el chocolate, Laura Esquivel proyecta un mundo matriarcal enmarcado en la revolución, donde las recetas de cocina sazonan los amores fallidos y triunfantes de los personajes. En la misma ruta de la novela histórica, es evidente la preocupación de los escritores por buscar las raíces y comprender el resultado que se vive día a día. De este modo, Rosa Beltrán indagó en el imperio de Agustín de Iturbide algunas de las problemáticas de la independencia, sin que la verdad histórica fuera su preocupación. Más recientemente, María Rosa Palazón acudió a la biografía novelada con su relato Imagen del hechizo que más quiero. Con una prosa viva y con una documentación de primera mano, la autora da cuenta de la vida de José Joaquín Fernández de Lizarde, a la vez que adereza la secuencia narrativa con elementos contextuales.
Here, Dr. Garcia is talking about this sort of renaissance and bigger presence of women writers in Mexico with novela histórica, historical fiction. And so he mentions Ángeles Mastretta, Laura Esquivel, authors who talk about Revolución Mexicana, the Mexican Revolution, but from the point of view of women. And so they analyze critically in fiction the machismo of the revolution, the chauvinistic culture of revolutionaries and even revolutionary ideals.
Es evidente que en este esbozo no están todos los que son, aunque sí se ha intentado que sean todos los que están. La guía de este escrito, la identidad de lo mexicano, y esto mismo como tema omnipresente, permiten comprender la naturaleza y sentido de nuestras letras, siempre en movimiento, siempre en una dialéctica que enriquece su cuerpo, siempre viva y en crecimiento. Nuestra literatura se afianza ahora como una de las más ricas, abiertas, y un abanico de propuestas amplio en el contexto latinoamericano. Así pues, de Sor Juana a Rosario Castellanos, de Fernández de Lizardi a Carlos Fuentes, de los cronistas españoles de la conquista a los cronistas estilo Monsiváis, nuestras letras han indagado constantemente en la esencia de lo que somos como cultura, como pueblo. Afortunadamente, esta indagación no culmina, y así, la historia continúa siempre descubriendo que la esencia permanece siempre latente.
Okay, as way of conclusion, Dr. Garcia mentions many iconic authors in Mexican literature, from Sor Juana, Rosario Castellanos, Carlos Monsiváis. He even mentions the colonial, the conquest chronicles like Cortés. So it's to show that Mexican literature is rich, dynamic, it's evolving, changing all the time, and has a lot to offer to the sort of the Latin American literary landscape and the world. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much, both Philip and Dr. Garcia. I'm very sorry for the technical difficulties. This is something that we have to deal with in this new age of technological presence only, and not physical presence that we miss so much. I hope I did a little bit of justice to Dr. Garcia's presentation. I did what I could, given the circumstances. Do we have a little time for questions or comments? Maybe Dr. Garcia can speak a little more now. Doctor García, ¿podemos
escucho ahora, aunque la imagen creo que se ve. Sí, adelante.
Sí, para que usted...
Te escucho bien, aunque no veo la... No...
Bueno, tal vez
adelante,
mejor
si hay preguntas,
así.
De acuerdo, adelante. Sí.
Si usted quería hacer algunos comentarios.
No, bueno, ya simplemente estaba diciendo al final, cuando se cortó nuevamente la comunicación, que la revolución fue un evento histórico muy relevante porque de ahí se generaron diversas corrientes literarias. Mencionaba la propia de la Revolución Mexicana, la literatura de la Revolución Cristera, de la Guerra Cristera, la indigenista, en fin. Junto a esto hubo otro movimiento muy importante en el que Alfonso Reyes ocupó un lugar primordial, el de los ateneístas, porque esto generó una literatura, por otro lado, cosmopolita, abierta, que es la que vincula otra vez a la tradición europea. Todo esto llega a la década de los 50 y sobre todo a los 60, muy rica en producción literaria en México, que abona a esta literatura del boom, el boom latinoamericano. Entonces, ahí tendremos figuras de primordial relevancia hasta llegar, pues, a lo que la profesora Vania muy amablemente leía, ¿no? Ya hacia el final del siglo pasado, hay una vuelta a esta novela histórica desde una perspectiva lúdica, desde una perspectiva de lo kitsch, etc. En fin, me disculpo por la comunicación que no ha sido lo mejor que uno quisiera.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Dr. Garcia was sort of recapping or providing a sort of bridge, historical bridge between what he said last and then what Vanya very kindly read aloud. So those decades that were missing, he wanted to point out again the sort of the key role of the Revolución Mexicana and Mexican Revolution as sort of the source of the main trends in Mexican literature, with a literature more about the revolution and the lives of the revolutionaries, and another trend, a parallel trend from the city, a more urban literature that will give way in time to what's called the boom in Latin American literature, with authors like Carlos Fuentes, to later on give way to what we were talking about, a renaissance of the historical novel, but more from a sort of a kitsch angle, a ludic angle, which from postmodernity. So now we have some time for questions, comments. Philip, would you like to make some comments? I do have some questions. I need to look back to my notes, but I appreciate if anybody else wants to make questions.
Hay un par de preguntas en el chat.
Okay. So the first question seems to be for Dr. García, una pregunta para usted. ¿Cuándo surge el adjetivo literatura mexicana? No cuándo aparece la literatura en México, sino cuándo y quién reconoció por primera vez que existía o que había aparecido una literatura nacional propia de México. So, I translate for the audience. The question is basically, when did the idea, the concept, the realization of Mexican literature appear?
Sí, gracias. Esta es una de las cuestiones justamente que se plantea como una de las premisas de un trabajo mucho más amplio, porque justamente el determinar ese apellido de mexicano, que es lo que quería señalar para esa literatura, es algo realmente controvertible. Y entonces llegar a determinar con precisión el momento en el que aparece esta literatura, diversos autores estudiosos, quiero decir, van a involucrar lo mexicano desde lo prehispánico. Algunos hablarán de la independencia, a partir de la independencia, y yo me quería detener un poco más, pero bueno, el tiempo apremia y también la cuestión tecnológica, como en el siglo XX hay elementos de diferentes corrientes y sobre todo ya hay una política muy clara, ¿no? Que surge a partir justo de esa Revolución Mexicana en adelante, un programa político desde que triunfa o hubo una ala triunfadora en la Revolución Mexicana y empieza esta concepción del Estado mexicano del siglo XX en el que se llevan a cabo políticas culturales orientadas justamente a definir eso que es lo mexicano, no solo para la literatura, sino para todos los demás contextos o demás áreas, perdón, de la cultura.
So,
así que responder puntualmente es muy difícil esto y controvertido.
Yes, so Dr. Garcia is responding to this question about when or how this idea of Mexican literature emerged, and he says it's very hard to ascertain a specific punctual origin. He says before Revolución Mexicana, the Mexican Revolution, there were some attempts to try and trace the idea of a Mexican literature in pre-Hispanic times. But then after the Mexican Revolution, it was a clear cultural project of the revolution to define and to delineate and sort of construct what is Mexican, right? So Mexico as a project, as a cultural project. So we could say that Mexican literature as such is part of this ideological project that was born of the revolution, of the Mexican Revolution. Was there a question for Philip, José?
Sí, hay una, está antes. De hecho, ya la contestó.
Ah, okay. But I may be able to share it with the audience. Ah, okay. The question was, and I want to share it with the audience, and maybe Philip can comment a little bit. The question was, are there Maori writers of the 19th century who addressed the deforestation issue? Was the settlers' domination of nature and environmental issues present in Maori literature? Did Maori literature contest European settlers' points of view?
It's a very good question, and it brings up some issues to do with the nature of Maori writing, and in particular in English. And what we tend to think of is that actually Maori writers using I guess the kind of colonial forms of poetry or the novel that tends to start occurring in English in the 20th century. So Maori is certainly writing in the 19th century, but more politically, I guess, in English, maybe occasionally in newspapers, petitions to government and letter writing in these forms. And then there's a whole lot of writing in Māori itself, again in newspapers and so on. But if we're taking a narrow literary focus, there is very little, there's nothing really to find, which makes it very, very hard to access those Māori perspectives through literature. You have to look in other places, and also to be able to speak Māori, especially it was written in the 19th century. It's a very good question, and it highlights the one-sided nature of our literary archive in the 19th century, which I tried a little bit to address just by bringing in some discussion of Māori worldviews, but again, it's hard to say much about what is not there, except to acknowledge that it isn't there, and it's very difficult. Yeah.
Yes, well, thank you, Philip. Thank you very much. So this ties up neatly to what Leonel was saying in the previous panel, when he was talking about this Kiwi author traveling in Central America, and in one of the poems saying, with no myth, right? A nation with no myth, looking at the world. How sad in a way, but prototypical of the times, right? Considering that New Zealand had no myths at that point, when in fact there was a whole culture rich and full of myths and beauty.
Yeah, very good point. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? I want to thank then Profesor García Pérez. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos, por contarnos, darnos este panorama de la literatura mexicana. Thank you very much, Philip Tenacue, for telling us a very sad story, in fact. The images are heart-wrenching, the images that you shared with us, and the poems too. But, well, part of the history of Aotearoa, New Zealand, no?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.